Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Nick Ellsmore. Nick is the co-founder of Hivint, now a part of Trustwave, an Optus company, and creator of the cybersecurity collaboration portal Security Colony. Named the inaugural ASA Information Security Professional of the Year for his contribution to the Australian cybersecurity industry, Nick was previously co-founder of SIFT and Stratsec and has served on boards and forums including the Internet Industry Association, the NATA AAC for software testing, the University of New South Wales Advisory Boards, and the APEC TEL Security and Prosperity Steering Group. One of Australia's most respected cybersecurity advisors, Nick has been engaged by regional governments to review their national cybersecurity strategies and has delivered projects for organisations around the world, including APEC and the United Nations, as well as hundreds of projects within Australia over the last 19 years. Nick, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Excellent. Thanks, Claire. Look, it's great to finally get a chance to chat.
So tell me a bit more about how you got to this point in your career. How did you go from being a network engineer to being a serial founder of information security businesses?
So I was interested in security from a young age. I think I started reading about information security and hacking and things back at school. And when I went to university, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I did information systems, econometrics, and business law. So it was pretty broad within commerce. And the part that actually caught my heart the most, I guess, was actually business law, and particularly the crossover between law and security. And so this is back in sort of the late 90s when we were going through this phase where cryptography was still considered a dual-use good. There were cases being prosecuted in the US of people exporting arms associated with sending sort of cryptographic software over the border. And so it's just a fascinating time. And I started sort of researching it a lot. I actually spent 6 months and wrote a sort of mini thesis on the export control regime on software in Australia, or on cryptographic software in Australia, and ended up becoming an expert on it. And this is sort of one of my starting pieces of advice for people who are trying to get into the industry is, if you pick an issue or a topic that is sufficiently narrow and small that no one else is looking at it, then it's significantly easier to become an expert on that than it is to become an expert on something really, really big and common. So I started SIFT off the back of that and just started building. I'm sure you haven't had too many people quote The Rock in your interviews, but one of the things he says is that you can always control whether or not you're the hardest worker in the room. And for the early SIFT years, it was really just all work all the time. Over about a decade, I pretty much said yes to every event I got invited to. I did radio, TV, newspaper. I wrote articles, gave about 100 presentations, and I just tried to be everywhere. And, along with hopefully delivering some good projects along the way, I think it was just that kind of presence in the industry in terms of always being there that got things started.
No, I've never had someone quote The Rock on my podcast, especially someone who has the background that you've got. The two don't really seem to fit together. But anyway, speaking of your background, you've been building teams for 2 decades. What are some of the principles you've followed to bring the right people together? So do you change your principles if you're hiring employees number 1, 2, and 3 of your startup, compared to when you get up to the 50 and 60 staff in your organisation? Are your principles always the same, and sort of how do you use them?
Yeah, look, it's cliched, but cultural, perhaps attitude is a better word, is the thing that comes first. A level of ability is required to make it into the discussion at all, but finding people who are willing to embrace your beliefs, your vision, your passion, is always going to be much, much more important. Something I read about probably about 20 years ago now, but it stuck with me ever since, is this. There's a concept called intelligent disobedience. And intelligent disobedience is often talked about in the context of guide dogs. And the principle is basically, a guide dog is taught to follow the lead of the person that they're looking after, unless there's a good reason not to. So it's if I ask you to walk in this direction, then help me walk in this direction. But if you see there's a car coming, don't let me walk in that direction. And so the concept of intelligent disobedience is basically, if you have to choose between what you are sure is right and what a policy says you should do, I want the person who will do what's right. And, you're absolutely right that person number 2, 3, and 4 in the company are critical to that, because when you get to 50 and 60, they're going to be mimicking behaviours they see from 2, 3, and 4. And so it's really, really important that those early hires have the right principles and the right sort of decision-making framework about how they approach life.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point that a lot of it's about attitude, and obviously having the right people in the early days, because they'll kind of be the long-termers, even if you haven't been in an organisation for very long, or the organisation's not that old. So in terms of those skills, obviously they're things. Attitude is something that can't really be taught, but the technical skills and that side of things, we had Craig on the podcast on episode 3, your business partner, and he shared his view on the skills crisis that cyber might be having. And I'm interested in your thoughts because, as you mentioned, attitude's one thing, but what about the skills side of things, and how do you feel about bringing people on and that might have the right attitude but not the entire amount of skills that you might need?
Yeah, I'm sure you're not overly surprised that Craig and my views are fairly similar. Yeah. I do have a tendency sometimes to push the envelope with some of these things. I gave a presentation at the ACET National Conference a couple of years back, and I think it was called Slaughtering Sacred Cows. And it's basically about dispelling myths in the industry. And the skills crisis was one that I touched on. So my argument that I made then and that I'll make now is that we don't have a skills crisis so much as we have a roles crisis. And in terms of what that means, it means that the roles that we currently have in our organisations are often ill-fitting for the needs of the organisation's cybersecurity programs. And so that they're not actually meaningfully reducing the risk that organisations face. I think we still have too many people managing the perception of security rather than the reality of security in a lot of organisations. And so the difference between a roles crisis and a skills crisis is that a roles crisis argues that the people with the skills exist, they're just not in the right place. Whereas a skills crisis, I think, argues that the people with the skills don't exist. I believe they do. I believe they're not in the right place. And I think there are a few things that drive that. The first is sort of a lack of innovation in recruitment. The second, I think, is a lack of willingness to invest in training. And the third is, I think in our industry, there's still a desire to make what we do look special, to preserve our day in the sun. And I totally understand that, in that we've spent the last 10 or 20 years trying to get people to pay attention to information security, and they do now. So the last thing we want to do is stand up and say it's not actually that unique. But I actually think that's what we have to do. I think 80% of the skill set required for a cybersecurity professional has nothing to do with cybersecurity. It's analytical thinking, it's problem solving, it's creativity, it's judgment. And I think the point that Craig talked about was around doing internal secondments and things within organisations. And I think that's really one of the best things that I recommend, which is if you run a kind of like a capture the flag or a cybersecurity challenge within your organisation, you'll find that 90% of staff won't participate. 90% of those that do participate will do it for giggles and stop after the first exercise. But the 10% of the 10% who see it as a challenge to prove themselves and work all the way through are probably going to be some of the best cybersecurity talent that you have in the organisation. and they're probably not in the cybersecurity team.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that idea that it's the roles that are the issue and not the skills. And, you know, I'm in agreement with you and quite a number of my guests actually that the skills crisis is not what it's being made out to be. And I think to concentrate a lot on filling these roles in any way, shape or form that we can. And I don't necessarily think that that's the right approach. It needs to be the right person for the role. And I guess that brings me to my standard diversity question. And, you know, we spoke a little bit about the work that Hivint has done around diversity and some really innovative thinking. Is there anything that you specifically have done, not necessarily at Hivint, but maybe even in your Stratsec days, around diversity and what your thinking is around whether or not it's something that we need to be focused on?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about diversity is we talk about it these days as if it's something that we need to actively pursue, whereas in reality, diversity is normal in life. It is the natural state of things. And the problem that we have as an industry is that over many decades, we've actually suppressed diversity. So the distinction is important because it's trying to say that when we're building diversity in order to do that, all you have to do is just stop squeezing diversity out. Diversity will naturally come because that is the way of the world. So the way that we actually approach that in practice is, we just really try and open up our recruitment processes as broadly as we can. So we don't limit it to people with particular certifications or backgrounds or years of experience. We just want great security consultants or people with the capacity to grow into being great security consultants. And that is, by its nature, a really diverse group. And that's diversity in every sense in terms of gender, background, ethnicity, religion, and also the sort of working backgrounds. We have lawyers, sociologists, recruiters, yes, a bunch of people who've come through IT and computer science and cybersecurity. But it's a broad mix because you need that to be able to have the diversity of thought to be able to find solutions to problems that we haven't seen before. And I think that's kind of the key focus for us and always has been our key focus both at Hivint and previously, which is we want to be the firm that people turn to when they have a problem that they haven't seen before. It's one thing for a consulting firm to be able to do a PCI audit and do it. Yes, you can have a good audit and a bad audit, but it's pretty well documented and pretty well proceduralized. It's a different thing when someone gives you a problem that genuinely you haven't seen before and no one's seen before. And at that point, you just have to go back to first principles and figure out the best answer you can.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mention clients asking you to solve problems that they haven't seen before and potentially you haven't seen before as well. What sort of roles are clients asking Hivint consultants to fill in terms of security skills? Is it the regular kind of outsourced stuff around pen testing, or is it strategy skills? Is there something that your clients are looking for over and over in terms of that role they need filled?
Yes, the best way I can answer that is to say that the larger the client, the narrower the role they tend to look for. So we have some really large clients, and in those we'll generally have a really niche role. As an example, there's one client that I work with, and the main thing that I do is write board reports. So very, very narrow. It's just writing board reports, audit committee reports around their cybersecurity state and cybersecurity program. That type of niche role is the sort of thing that's only going to exist in a large enough organisation to warrant it. But for smaller clients, and by this I don't necessarily mean SMEs, but say a financial services company with 200 or 300 staff, it tends to be much broader. So we're basically, in that case, the solution to the fact that they can't find a single person who can do everything in cyber. So they're trying to find a single security manager who can manage their firewall, write their board reports, respond to an incident, run awareness training, conduct forensic investigations, and that person's a unicorn. They just don't exist. And so we tend to then coming in to either fill the gap between the team or the capability that they do have and the total state of everything being covered, or to basically be a sort of virtual security manager, and then there might be one person who's there for 2 days a week who's the coordinator, but then they use the whole Hivint team to be able to deal with the fact that there's actually 5 or 6 different skill sets that are needed to make up one security manager in a relatively small organisation.
And do you find that across the country, because I know you guys have offices in sort of the major capital cities, do you find there's a difference? I mean, Perth's such a small place and Sydney and Melbourne are obviously the hubs of corporate activity. Do you find that across the country clients make different demands, or is it more about the size of the organisation?
It's a really interesting question. So going back 10 years, I would have said definitely yes. 10 years ago, for whatever reason, it seemed that Sydney just constantly wanted testing and Melbourne constantly wanted compliance. But today that dynamic doesn't really exist anymore. We tend now to have pretty similar looking teams in the different regions. And the clients seem to engage with us asking for pretty similar services. So I don't think there is now any real difference in terms of sort of organisational maturity, cybersecurity maturity, or sort of tendency towards one service set or another. The only sort of asterisk on that is obviously each state from a state government perspective will have their own sort of compliance requirements and approach within state government. But more broadly, it's pretty broadly consistent now, which is interesting, and in a sense says its own thing about the way that the industry's kind of progressed over that time period to sort of harmonise where everyone's up to.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about the change over time, and I certainly think that organisations have started to wake up to the need to have security staff within their organisation, and I guess complement that with organisations such as yourselves or whichever they choose in terms of third parties who can bring that really sort of sharp, up-to-date security advice. If you were approached by one of your clients who wanted to start building the function themselves inside their organisation, what would your advice be about where they should start? So, are they best to start with a leader? Are they best to start with an analyst, an architect? I mean, what, from your perspective, is a great place to start?
It depends a little on, and I always laugh when I start an answer with "it depends," because it's the perpetual consultant answer to a question. But it depends a little on how big the function's going to be, in the sense that if you're building a function of 3 people, you've got a little less latitude than if you're building a function of 10. And it also depends a little on where they're starting from. So, do you need a salesperson to get the budget, or do you have the budget and you need a program manager to execute it properly? But in a sense, even that discussion is a little of what I was sort of referring to earlier when discussing that a lot of security isn't that different to other disciplines, or at least the security knowledge alone isn't often what's going to get the job done. So my sort of overall advice would be, one, to find someone pragmatic and someone who can build relationships, because again, the discussion before about the number 2, 3, or 4 hire in a company, your first security manager in an organisation is going to shape the way that function is perceived by the organisation. We went through the dark ages for 10 or 15 years where the security team was considered the Department of No, because pretty much that's what we spent our time saying. So I think it's now very important to make sure that the first hire in a security team, in a security function, is either going to be able to be that salesperson, and that's both up to get the budget and also throughout the organisation to explain why they're there and that they are actually a force for good. And I think a lot of the key for that is someone who is pragmatic and who knows the difference between security and compliance.
On that point, I mean, I love the idea that who you hire is dependent on how big you plan for your team to be. And I think that's a really important point, that security leaders really need to plan how big their team is going to be and the types of roles they want in it, and that sort of operating model before they go out to market for the first role, because you can't really know the components or the non-negotiables of each candidate until you've planned out sort of what your vision is about, I suppose. From your perspective, and having built teams and companies and having met a lot of people, in terms of the types of staff that come in, have you seen any ultimate path? You know, I think security leaders come from such different places, and so do potentially security professionals. And Hivint have shown that, you know, you mentioned before, you've got lawyers, you've got social workers, you've got people from all across the demographics. Is there an ultimate path? Should someone cut their teeth in one place or another?
I think that, you know, the easy answer is whatever's going to make most sense for the organisation that's recruiting. I guess what I mean by that is there are so many different types of security leaders, and you know, I remember reading somewhere this concept that if you get to the point where you're a CEO, at the CEO level, you know, you basically need to be able to condense what you do in big picture terms down to a sentence, if not a few words. You know, and basically there are CEOs who are they're growth leaders. There are CEOs who are builders or acquirers, and they just go and acquire lots of companies. There are CEOs who are, you know, cost cutters, and pretty much, you know, that's your future, which is an organization that is going to bring in a cost-cutting CEO who every CEO role they cut costs is doing that because they want that CEO to cut costs. So I think for sort of security leaders, in a sense, the question is, you know, what are you about? What is that message that you have that is going to sort of set you apart, or going to make it really, really easy for everyone to understand what it is that you do? And it can't be, I secure things. It's like, yep, great. We're all here to secure things. We're all in the security team. You know, maybe it's, and also, you know, we went through this period where a lot of CIO roles started going to CFOs or ex-CFOs, because the CIO role was suddenly about contract management because everyone was outsourcing things. And so it was actually much more of a finance function than it was a technology function. So, you know, there's that discussion about, as a security leader, you know, are you there to move things out into a managed security service provider? You know, are you there to try and consolidate systems and try and really reduce the threat profile? Are you there to, you know, try and loosen things up, try and actually get the business moving faster by sort of opening up the risk appetite a little bit? And I think having that sort of thought process will then allow you to think about sort of what background you need to have, what you need to do to be that person and to get to that point. But in terms of, you know, the ideal background, at the very, very start of my career, in fact, even before SIFT, there was a sort of broader IT services company that I ran, and we did a lot of software testing. So not security testing, just software testing. So basically, you get given a script, you open up a piece of software, you enter the data from the script into the software and make sure that it does the right thing. And we used to, you know, need, you know, a dozen or 24 software testers pretty regularly, and we're actually doing work for one of the big banks. And so I put an ad at UNSW on one of the sort of student notice boards, and had, you know, I'd always have a bunch of people apply, and this one guy who became a good friend, Anton, applied, and, you know, I have a chat to him, and he came in for an interview, and I'll always remember it because it's the most sort of upbeat and positive interview I think I've ever been a part of. And, you know, Anton, so, you know, you previously worked at, you know, I think it was David Jones, you know, selling mattresses. What was that like? I'm trying to say, oh, you know, that was fantastic. I loved it because, you know, I got to talk to people, and it was just such a great experience. It's like, wow, okay. And then, you know, you're in telemarketing for a while. how did you find that? I loved it. It was the best. I'd go into work and I'd just phone people and talk to people all day. And it was just amazing. I just got to talk to people and I got paid for it. And I still, to this day, don't think I've ever met anyone who is so entirely positive about just all of the things that they'd done. Other people would look at it and go, "Oh, telemarketing, that'd be soul destroying." But he just really enjoyed it and always found a way to be happy. And so I think for me, if I'm recruiting a CISO, or in fact, if I'm recruiting sort of any of the roles down that path, the person that I want is the person who is clearly going to be passionate about it and care about it, and is going to put in the time to be able to do the right thing, but also someone that's a nice person. You can't overstate the importance of being a nice human being and a positive human being. And I think sometimes we sort of neglect that part when it really is pretty important.
I like the idea at the start of your answer just then around, the value that person can offer and why they do what they do. And I think that's just as important as why the organisation is hiring. And, trying to match those two things is often not an easy task, but it's about the organisation doing some hard thinking about why they need that person in their organisation, and also about the person doing some thinking around why they're applying and why they want to be part of that business. And, you mentioned that it's about being a good person as well, and I guess the values that person has. There's so many components to getting the right fit of an employee with an organisation and vice versa. It's a massive challenge, and you guys have done an incredible job of doing that time and time again.
Thanks, Claire. Look, I think there's been some good luck along the way as well. And I'm not sure if Craig told how he ended up here. I mean, back at SIFT, when SIFT was just myself and my co-founder in a virtual office, Craig pretty much just turned up to the office one day after, I think, finding our website and said that he liked what we stood for and wanted to join. And so, there's certainly some good luck along the way, but a lot of it also comes down to, relationships and hard work.
That sounds like something Craig would do. That's a brilliant story. Yeah. I like to ask all my podcast guests if they had some advice for their 20-year-old self. What do you wish you'd known back then about building teams? And given that you've built some great teams and you've been their leader, is there something that you wish you had have known back then that if you had have applied it, things might have been different?
I'm not sure whether it's sort of if I'd applied it, some things would have been different. But I think I had an early sort of understanding, but it's really sort of grown over the last few years about the importance of having a compelling story. And the other way to look at it is a creation myth. And every good startup has a creation myth. Why does it exist, and what was the specific genesis that started it at a particular point in time? And I think the reason that's so important is, again, one of the sort of leadership books or something I read at some stage said, that nobody wants a life of boredom, and that particularly for sort of Gen X's, Gen Y's, and the other generations that have come after that, and you've got people moving jobs a lot more regularly. People get bored quickly, and just a job is often boring. So it can't just be a job. There has to be a compelling story that you have to be able to tell, and then of course you need to be able to live the values that the story embodies. But it's just, I think the question that I would say needs to be asked and answered more, and if I went back to my 20-year-old self, would just be, when you're starting these companies, just be really, really clear with everyone about why, and just keep telling people why. Tell them the vision, tell them the dream, tell them what you're building and why it's important. I know Craig, when he was speaking with you, referred to our fairly simple premise that people need to give a shit. And it's absolutely that. It's very easy in our industry to forget that what we're doing actually matters a great deal. When we're talking about when we're pen testing a system or we're doing a risk assessment or whatever else, it's easy to just see it as another system for another client, rather than realizing that it's the system that is going to be protecting our health data, into the future or something like that. It has very, very real impact. And when you can actually rally the team around, what we're doing, the importance of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and the fact that what we're doing is exciting and important, it builds the team much, much stronger than if it's just a bunch of people getting a paycheck.
I think start with why and keep telling why is some pretty sound advice. And I really want to thank you, Nick, for being part of the podcast today. I've really enjoyed chatting, and I think some of your answers were pretty compelling and that the audience will really enjoy listening. So I'm really grateful for your time. And where can people find you online if they are looking? Twitter, LinkedIn, those types of places. Where should people look you up?
Yeah, so I'm pretty easy to find. The best place is LinkedIn. As far as I can tell, there are 3 Nick Ellsmores on LinkedIn, but I'm the only one in cyber. So
right.
I'm always open to new connections. So, please do reach out if you're interested.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks heaps, Nick.
Thanks, man.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.